In thinking about the audience for news, we are at a crisis point when it comes to journalism. We do have a responsibility to come up with some ideas that can help us make sure that we have an audience for news in the future.
So the first question was talking about the 7 types of news consumers. The first one was news enthusiasts, and this is old school people that are really enthusiastic about the news. They're strongly connected to it, and they feel a devotion to actually seek out news and stay informed. And the second one is news monitors, who have a slight connection to keep up with the news and watch out for things that may be relevant to them.
News accidentals, which are like news consumers who have a weak connection to news. There's staunch news, which is non-purposeful, usually happens when not looking for news. Other one is news intenders and news avoiders. I guess number 2 would be like more of a discussion.
News betweeners are those who look for news 1 to 6 days per week, and then news eclectics are people that don't really follow a specific news consuming pattern. They can be any one of the news consumers on any given day.
There's also news avoiders, the people that just avoid news in general and for whatever reason don't feel an obligation to stay informed.
Okay, well, and for the second question, it was talking about picking 2 different types of news consumer groups and then telling like how socialization and attitudes relate to that. And I did for news enthusiasts, and I said that the socialization process is the most important because if you're raised in an environment where you see the news every day on TV or your parents read the newspaper and then you grow up to read the newspaper too, you're most likely to become a news enthusiast and have a more positive attitude and be more motivated.
And then on the other hand, there's the news avoiders, and they usually grow up in households where their parents don't watch the news. They don't present the news to them in any sort of way, so they just kind of grow up not even wanting or caring to watch the news or read the news.
And like, I don't really think that you're stuck being one type of consumer like your entire life.
All right, well, we had 3 and 4. And question 3 was, what are reasons for avoiding news? We kind of thought lack of time was an overall kind of comprehensive consensus from newspaper and internet about why people avoided news.
The TV news and internet, they listed a couple other reasons. Reasons for avoiding the TV news included like dissatisfaction with the content was a pretty big one. Like people prefer reading the newspaper and they don't kind of trust TV news as much. And then people avoided the internet news because they already read the newspaper. And then like the older generation, they don't use the internet at all, so they really didn't know how.
Some people avoided the newspaper because of language problems, and I'm sure that's like an increasing problem in America.
I thought it was interesting that they made a distinction in the book between real constraints and perceived constraints, and a lack of time is a perceived constraint.
I found it interesting that lack of time was the #1 reason for people on TV and newspaper, and then internet, where there's obviously no reason why you can't get on the internet. Lack of interest jumps to #1. So I felt like in many ways maybe lack of time is just kind of masking. I don't know, I'm too busy to read the news versus I'm really not that interested. I don't feel like I'm missing anything in my day.
Okay, I'll go into 4. Basically, is the distinction between wave 1 and wave 2 millennials. We all, obviously talking afterwards, kind of came to the consensus that there's a distinction. The years probably be around like early to mid 80s to maybe like 1990-ish for wave 1 millennials, and then wave 2 would probably be early to mid 90s. I think about when I was in elementary school, like we learned about computer and like how to play a game on it, whereas now they learn about the internet on the computer. So that to me is a big distinction. Probably for wave 2, there'll be news accidentals and kind of turn into maybe news enthusiasts just because it's there all the time.
With that in mind, I think the wave 1 millennials also are more prone to probably use traditional news mediums such as the newspaper or maybe network news, where I feel like the younger kids are probably using social networking or the internet. Wave 1s also are probably more in tune to like hard news. I know one of the things I've noticed with younger kids, entertainment news has become such a huge deal. That's like permeating.
I think in some of the later chapters it talked about how news organizations should try to make the hard news more relevant and more interesting to the audience. So I think that would be kind of a way around this problem. Maybe they're not interested in politics, they're not interested in their local news as much, but that does affect them, and if they can just see how that's important, if they could write the news to seem important to everyone, that might really help.
So my tweet about finding millennials in the news, I wrote, to find millennials in the news has to find them first.
I said pretty much the same thing. News has to find them, and I think it's partly because what we said earlier in our questions. Now we're not being socialized to look for the news and to stay informed. We're becoming accidentals, and like it has to be something, mass murder or something that pops out.
Talking about the societal divide, I don't know, there was this whole big thing about news as a civic responsibility, and I guess Wave 2 millennials really haven't had anything. I mean, do you think that plays any role in seeking out the news, the fact that we haven't had any major political events to get involved in?
See, I'd say the opposite. I'd say that 9/11 was so big, it completely revolutionized news.
But not as far, I don't feel like that though, as far as like youth involvement, like the civil rights movement, people picketing and getting sprayed down with hoses and stuff, or Vietnam.
Yeah.
I think that might be. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, I think with as we saw in Buying the War, journalism really failed us during the lead up to the Iraqi war, and I think that would turn a lot of people off from the news if that's their first exposure to it.
Yeah.
Page 126 says, the solution to cultivating the next generation's interest in news may be in the wireless capability that is growing part of the news media landscape. Only by understanding and addressing the interests and needs of what might be called the wireless generation can the news media, especially newspapers, realistically hope to attract the attention of this age group before it turns away for good.
I find that I get most of my news online. I just think that that's the trend. If people in our Wave 1 generation are doing that, then Wave 2 is certainly going to be doing that.
Newspapers have been a very, very elite institution in the sense that they were interested in one group, high demographics, more in the Middle Ages. Newspapers did not need to and didn't think about young people. And so now, all of a sudden, it's not only the youngest people, it is the older groups too, because if you look at circulation figures, every age group, regardless of the age group, is turning away. So newspapers, in a variety of ways, shot themselves in the foot, and now they're trying to figure out and scramble, and still haven't figured out that it's really, you got to do something. You have to invest in the future generation because you're losing the current generation.
Number 7 is from Chapter 6. Identify one recommendation for appealing to Wave 1 millennials that you think would work for Wave 2 millennials.
I said answering the question, so what? Because I think a lot of newspapers or news sources still don't do this because they spend so much time covering Balloon Boy, and you can't answer the question so what with that. It is so what. But also stories that do matter, like the healthcare reform, they don't explain to us that it's that's going to be affecting us a lot less than some middle-aged person.
I agree with you, and I think the big problem with that is that news organizations, when they interview people, they interview middle-aged people because they are quote-unquote credible. So why don't they talk to us, who are the people who should be the ones being talked to, but we're not credible?
I think that the 2008 election was a perfect example of what happens when you pay attention to a particular demographic, in this particular case, young people. Because more young people voted in the 2008 election than at any other time since probably the Vietnam War. And the reason for that, part of the reason for that, because there was an effort to seek out young people. There was an effort to try to explain to them, why this matters and so forth. If you pay attention to somebody, if you explain to them why it matters, why you should care, then they're very likely going to care back.
Number 8, so knowing what we know today about the rapid transformation of the news media landscape, what recommendation is the most relevant today and why?
Well, basically, I just said that for millennial to age people to become more involved, like we've said before, there needs to be more stories that are related to them as they grow up. And I just said that continuously giving them more opportunities to look at news, adding it through text messages, adding it through every single social network possible. Just completely bombarding them with the news maybe would get them more interested if you put the right content in their face. And I think that would lead them to look at more important things.
Okay, good job.